Today we will go over the supplies you'll need, how to cast on, how to do a knit stitch, how to do a purl stitch, how to bind off, and finally get knitting. So you decided that you want to learn how to knit. Luckily, there are only a few basic supplies that you will need to take off on your knitting career. Size 7 or 8 medium-sized knitting needles, medium worsted weight yarn, stitch markers, measuring tape, and scissors. The first thing is to cast on, so I'm going to make a slip knot. Once I have my slip knot, I can stick the needle in it and pull the yarn to tighten it. And then I'm going to stick my other needle inside of that knot. And then grab my working yarn that is attached to the ball of yarn and put it in between both the needles. Now I'm going to pull the loop of yarn through the first stitch using the right hand needle, and the loop should slip onto the left hand needle to form the second stitch. Now I'm going to put the right hand needle into the second stitch, and then I'm going to loop the yarn between both needles. Now I'm going to pull the loop of yarn through the second stitch using the right hand needle, and the loop should slip onto the left hand needle to form the third stitch. I'm going to continue putting the right hand needle into the stitch, looping the yarn between both needles and pulling the yarn through the loop onto the left hand needle until I reach my desired number of stitches. Now that I have made all my cast on stitches, I'm going to start knitting. So I'm going to stick my right hand needle into the first stitch on the left and bring it to the back. Now I'm going to pass or loop the yarn between both needles as we did for casting on. Finally, I'm going to pull the loop of yarn through the stitch to create a new stitch on the right hand needle. The cast on stitch on the left hand needle should transfer to a knit stitch on the right hand needle. I'm going to continue these steps by inserting the needle into the top stitch, wrapping the yarn around the needle, and pulling the loop of yarn off the needle and onto the right hand needle until I reach my desired amount of knit stitches. So I continued doing the knit stitch for a few rows, and these are all the knit or garter stitches that I made. Now to do the purl stitch, I first insert the needle from top to bottom into the first stitch. Now I'm going to pass or loop the yarn between both needles as I did for casting on and knitting. Finally, I'm going to pull the loop of yarn through the stitch to form a new stitch on the right hand needle. I'm going to keep inserting the needle into the stitch, looping the yarn around that needle, and pulling the loop of yarn off the needle until I complete a whole row of purl stitches. Once the desired amount of rows are complete, it's time to bind off. So first, knit 2 stitches. This is the first stitch. And then I will knit the second stitch. And now with your left hand needle, go in for the first stitch that you knitted, insert it in there, and pull it off the needle without pulling the second stitch off of it. There is going to be 1 stitch left on your right hand needle. So you're going to want to knit another stitch and pulling the first stitch over the second. Repeat this until you get to the end of your row. After you've finished binding off, you should have all of your stitches unattached to the needle except for one. So with this one stitch, you're just going to pull it off the needle, and normally you would cut it with scissors and thread the yarn through the loop to secure it. Now that you have mastered casting on, knitting, purling, and binding off, it is time to put those skills to the test. Look for any basic knitting patterns on Ravelry.com. You can knit anything from hats to scarves with the basic skills you have now. Make sure to filter the options by selecting beginner level patterns that cater to the size of knitting needles and yarn that you own. Next, it is time to get knitting. The possibilities are endless. Here are a few hats that I've knitted myself.